When I was just over 20 years old, I moved to a new neighborhood. It was a quiet area, not too far from the city. My place was a small duplex, which was more than enough for me. The rent was affordable, so I was happy to find it. It was just the ground floor, with someone living above. It had 2 bedrooms and an open space where the kitchen and living room were. There was only 1 bathroom, but since it was just me, it was fine. The extra room wasn't used for much. I planned to turn it into a guest room but hadn't done so yet. So, at that time, it was just an empty room. There was a small closet at one end and a window at the other. I always kept that window closed and locked because I never used it. I got a night job at a local warehouse, which meant my sleep schedule was all over the place. Most days, when I wasn't working, I stayed up all night. It didn't make sense to try to sleep at regular hours anyway, so I just adopted a nocturnal lifestyle. Given that I was on strange hours, making friends was difficult. I'm a fairly sociable person, but after months living there, I didn't know most of my neighbors. My neighbors to the right were a young family, whom I had only met once or twice. There was also a single guy, a few years older than me, with whom I had never really spoken. I had only seen him once or twice. Besides that, the rest might as well have been strangers. One night, I was sitting on the couch flipping through TV channels. It was around M, a time when pretty much everyone would be asleep. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was faint, but enough to spark my curiosity. As I said, I lived in a duplex, so occasionally there were noises from my neighbors at that hour, although it was rare. I decided to investigate just to ease my mind. So, I got up and walked through the house, but the sound didn't happen again. I checked the living room, the kitchen, and even the small bathroom. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to go back to the couch when I looked at the extra room. There was something strange about the window. I approached and stood in front of it. The window, which I normally kept locked, was broken. The glass wasn't shattered, but the latch was broken and clearly not fully closed. I looked closer, and when I examined the screen, I could see a small latch that I didn't think was there before. I hadn't opened that window, and no one else should have opened it either. At that moment, I was pretty sure someone had entered. I didn't know if they were still in the house or if they had left. I ran to my room to make sure nothing had been stolen. The only truly valuable thing I had was my MacBook Pro, but it was on my bed where I had left it. Although relieved, I now knew it wasn't a robbery. If someone was still in the house, there was no way to know how long they had been there. I had only noticed a faint noise, but there was no way to ignore someone opening that window. It would definitely have made a louder noise. Maybe it had happened when I wasn't there. The person had been in my house somewhere waiting for hours. I wasn't going to take any risks. I grabbed my phone and quickly left the house, locking the door behind me, though it didn't help much. As I walked down the street, I called the police. I waited outside, wondering what the hell was happening behind me. I thought I was going crazy, maybe too much coffee and sleepless nights. The police arrived after a while and went inside to check the house. After a few minutes of tension, I saw them come out. They had found someone inside. It was one of my neighbors, the guy I had seen but had never really spoken to. The police said he appeared disoriented and confused, and they found him in the closet of my room. I thought he was drunk or something. They took him into custody and left me to piece together what had happened. Sleeping was difficult in the days that followed. Later, I learned from the police that my neighbor claimed he had drunk too much and mistook my house for his. He broke the window when he couldn't get in through the locked door. I thought that didn't make sense. If he had entered by mistake, why would he hide in the closet? If he thought it was his own place, he would have walked right in. This guy must have been in there with me for hours, and the only indication of his presence was a faint noise and a broken window. Later, I found out that everyone in my neighborhood also thought this guy was odd. The break-in was a terrifying experience. I stayed in that place for almost a year after this happened, and that guy was still around. When I left, it was strange to see him on the streets, but neither of us said a word to the other. The idea that someone had been in my house hiding in my closet while I was there, haunted me. I became more cautious and always double-checked the locks on all doors and windows before going to bed. Even during the day, I felt uneasy, as if someone was lurking in the shadows. My interactions with my neighbor after this event were minimal. I would occasionally see him while walking around the neighborhood, but we never exchanged more than a simple greeting. However, every time I saw him, a sense of discomfort would wash over me. I couldn't shake the idea that this guy had been hiding in my house, watching me without my knowing. Eventually, I decided to move. Although the rent was affordable and the house met my basic needs, I could no longer endure the feeling of paranoia that gripped me whenever I was there. I looked for a new place in a different neighborhood, one that offered me more tranquility and security. When I finally moved, it was a huge relief. I could leave behind that terrifying episode and start anew in a place where I felt safer. However, the memory of the man in my closet never completely faded. I always stayed alert, aware that danger could be anywhere, even in the most familiar and seemingly safe places. From then on, I learned to trust my instincts and take extra measures to protect myself and my home.
I'm 32 years old, but when this happened, I was 12 or 13. My family and I lived in a house in a middle-class neighborhood. It was 2 stories with a finished basement, so there was plenty of space for me, my brother, and my sister. My sister was 2 years older, my brother a year younger. Many of our neighbors also had kids, so it was that kind of neighborhood. My best friend lived just a few houses away, and my brother's best friend lived next door. The family across the street was a bit older, so we didn't know their kids very well. Let's call them the Bennetts. There was a boy and a girl in that family. The boy, whom we'll call Brian, had been out of high school for a year but still lived at home. The girl, whom we'll call Lauren, was in her senior year of high school. One thing that was well known in our neighborhood, the Bennetts hated their neighbors next door. I never knew who started it, but the families fought like animals. The police were called more times than I can count, often for silly and minor things like noise complaints. The Bennetts even called the police once because the father thought someone had left leaves on his lawn, but they were actually from the trees. Brian also had a bad reputation in our area. My parents always told me not to talk to him, although I was much younger and probably wouldn't have done so anyway. I don't know everything he did, but one event still stands out. One morning, while walking to the bus stop to go to school, I noticed that one of our electrical transformers was destroyed. Those transformers looked like large metal boxes on the side of the road. Honestly, at the time, I didn't know what they were, but this one was in bad shape. I asked my parents about it, but they didn't know. Eventually, I found out that Brian had crashed his father's car into it. The accident was captured by someone's security camera. Brian was arrested on suspicion of driving under the influence because he was going back and forth on the road, zigzagging wildly. Unfortunately, he was released because, by the time the police arrived, it was too late for a breathalyzer test. Another time, about a year later, I was home alone one afternoon. My father was working, and my mother had taken my sister somewhere. I was in my room upstairs, doing homework with the TV on in the background. Then, there was a knock on the small window next to our front door. This was strange because most people would use the doorbell. I went upstairs to see from above where the noise was coming from. There was someone standing there, but from that angle, I couldn't tell who it was. I didn't bother to go downstairs because the person seemed too old to be one of my friends. I wasn't scared, just uninterested. I went back to my room and continued what I was doing. About 10 minutes later, I heard another knock, this time coming from the back of the house. It was on one of the windows of our deck. This time, I went downstairs because I was curious about who it was. When I turned the corner, the back windows came into view. I saw Mr. Bennett standing there in our yard, looking through the window. This may not seem frightening so far, but remember that our families were not friends. There was really no reason for him to come to our house, especially not to our yard. I turned and got out of sight as quickly as possible. When I was in the other room, I was pretty sure I heard him trying to open the door. I wanted to call my mother, but I knew she would be home soon anyway. I waited another 10 minutes or so and then saw her car pulling into the garage. I told her what had happened, and when my father got home, we reviewed the footage from our security camera. It showed our neighbor approaching our house and knocking on the window, as I said. But the really scary part was that it showed him trying to open the door, which was locked. Thankfully, he didn't enter or do anything, but it was quite unsettling. My father confronted Mr. Bennett. He denied everything at first, but when my father shouted that he had video evidence, he just made up some excuse. He told my father that he was checking on me, that I was too young to be home alone. Even though I was 13 and it would only be for half an hour, how would he know? He was watching our house, waiting for me to be alone. Things improved with them for a while. Nobody moved until after I left, so they were my neighbors for most of my life. Ryan eventually got arrested a few years later. He got into trouble for fighting on the street and had issues with assault and some other minor crimes. He didn't serve prison time because of the family's men's confusion. The mother always seemed really nice and normal, as did her daughter. I didn't know Lauren very well, but I'd sometimes see her playing basketball in the garage driveway, and she seemed friendly. That's all I can say about the Bennetts. I don't know what he wanted in our house. I still have a hard time believing he really wanted to hurt me, but why else would he try to get into our house while I was alone? I'm glad the door was locked. Although these incidents were disturbing, I never had more problems with the Bennetts. After that event, however, we always kept a certain distance and caution around them. Overall, those years in the neighborhood were a mix of happy moments with friends and family, but also marked by some tension and unsettling situations with the neighbors. Over time, my family and I moved to another place, leaving those experiences behind. But the lessons learned about the importance of security and vigilance were never forgotten. Those memories remain vivid in my mind, reminding me of the importance of staying alert and safe in any environment.
This happened in my old apartment a few years ago. It was one of those new condo buildings in the city center, the kind of place that looks like a modern art exhibit from the outside. Basically, it was all glass on the outside, with balconies for each unit. I rented the place through a friend of mine who had bought the unit a few years after college. She got a job in another city and decided to rent it out as an investment rather than sell it. At the time, I was looking for a new place, so it was perfect for both of us. She gave me a good deal since we were friends, and she knew I'd take good care of it. I knew some of the neighbors beforehand from when I used to visit. At first, it was like a small community. My place was on the 18th floor and had just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room. Outside the bedroom was a small balcony, and there were windows on both sides of it. In fact, all the exterior walls were practically floor to ceiling. After the first year, my neighbor moved out. He was a younger guy, in his 30s, and was quite nice. The guy who took his place was a bit older and gave me a bad vibe from the start. He had long hair and always wore a baseball cap. When he first moved in, I introduced myself and found out his name was Lucas. Lucas worked from home, and I didn't think he went out much except to go to the store. Sometimes I would hear strange noises coming from his place. Occasionally, out of nowhere, I'd hear him yelling obscenities. The walls were thick, so I knew he must have been yelling loudly. I wasn't sure if it was really a serious anger problem or if he was just a passionate sports fan. I know some people get really involved in those games. Unfortunately, it seemed more like the first option. One night, I was lying in bed. It wasn't too late, maybe around p.m. It wasn't completely dark yet, but the sun was almost down. I was looking at my phone, and my balcony door was to my left. Suddenly, I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. It looked like something outside my window. I set my phone aside and turned, but it was gone. I thought it was a bird, but that was rare on the 18th floor in my city. After looking out the window for a minute, I gave up and forgot about it. Another night, about a week later, I went out with some friends. I was the designated driver, so I wasn't drinking. While my friends were having their last round, I ordered a solo coffee just to make sure I was awake enough to drive them all home. So, when I finally got to my place, I wasn't ready to sleep. I stayed up for about an hour watching TV, but when the clock struck AM, I decided it was time to go to bed. Even then, I wasn't sleepy. At AM, I still couldn't fall asleep. That coffee seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was actually keeping me awake. I was lying on my side, looking out the window. The city skyline looked nice at night, and I was gazing at it while trying to sleep. Suddenly, I thought I noticed something. It was a red light flashing from the other side of my window, right next to my balcony. I stared at it for a few seconds, unsure of what I was seeing. It wasn't clear if it was near or far, but when I suddenly realized it was close, I got out of bed and went to the window. When I got there, I could see it was a camera on some kind of selfie stick. It looked like it could have been a GoPro or it could have been a regular camera, but I knew my neighbor was spying on me. Seconds after seeing it, it was jerked out of my view towards Lucas's apartment. I was very scared at that moment and called the police. To my surprise, they didn't do anything immediately. Apparently, my word wasn't enough to file a report about his place. I stayed at my mother's house for the next few days because I was too scared to be at home. I made sure to tell my neighbors what he had done. When I returned to my apartment, Lucas was still there, but fortunately, it didn't last long. I don't know how, but the police eventually managed to file a report about his place. It's unclear how involved he was, but spying wasn't the only illegal thing he was doing. The cybercrime unit in my city was also watching him. Once he was arrested, I never saw him again. I was allowed to view the footage he had of me, but I declined. There was no reason for me to do that. The police also told me they didn't believe he had ever shared it publicly, so that was good for me. It was the worst thing that's ever happened to me, having my privacy violated in that way. Even though Lucas was gone, I immediately started looking for a new place. When my friend found out what happened, she was more than happy to let me break my lease.
Before I bought my house, I lived in some problematic places, near some difficult people. I could continue sharing some of the things that happened to me during my 20s and early 30s, but this is the worst. I had a small apartment in an old building, and that's where I lived when I finished high school. I worked at an auto shop, mostly doing all changes, and the pay barely exceeded minimum wage, so this was the only place I could afford without getting a roommate, something I desperately wanted to avoid. My place was literally a single room with a kitchen in one corner. My bed was right in the middle of the room because there was no better place to put it, otherwise it would block the door. At first, I was happy enough, but the real problem was the neighbors. Since the building was old, you could hear everything. I don't know why old buildings are so bad in that respect. Maybe soundproofing hadn't been invented yet, or maybe it was the maintenance. All I know is that my apartment was constantly flooded with conversations, footsteps, and any other noise you could imagine. My neighbors next door were a married couple in their 30s. They were particularly loud and argued all the time, often until late at night. The man was named Ryan, he was a lawyer, and the woman was named Sarah, and she was a receptionist. At the time this happened, I had been unemployed for over a year and money was one of the main things they argued about. Their fights became a regular occurrence that I expected during my nights. I often tried to drown them out with music or TV shows. It wasn't just that they were yelling. I also occasionally heard things being thrown. I could never tell if there was physical violence, but I always worried. When I saw them in public, it was like they were a perfect couple. They always put on a happy face for me and the others in the building, but we all knew what was going on behind closed doors. I could never understand why they did this. They should have known that people could hear them. I never knew exactly how much to tolerate before calling the police. I had never intervened before this incident, but I had come close a few times. A month before this happened, I woke up in the middle of the night when one of them must have thrown something at the wall. There was a loud crash and the sound of breaking glass. I think it was a glass. I almost called the police but stopped because things seemed to calm down shortly afterward. On another night, they were arguing as usual. I remember sitting on the couch trying to listen to some music, but the noise was so loud that even my headphones couldn't block it out. I turned up the volume and managed to mostly ignore it for the next hour. Around 11 p.m., the noise stopped. I was getting ready for bed and didn't hear anything more from them. When I went to bed, I assumed they had done the same because it was quiet. While I was lying there trying to sleep, I heard a sound that could have been a gunshot. Then, a woman started crying. I knew it was Sarah. For a moment, I lay there in shock. Then, I got out of bed and lay on the floor for safety. I didn't know if those walls could stop a bullet. I grabbed my phone and called the police with my hands shaking while explaining what I had heard. I remember my voice was trembling as I spoke, and I was trying to stay as calm as possible so no one would hear me. The operator told me that help was on the way and that I shouldn't do anything else. I followed their advice, moving away from the wall I shared with the couple. From the moment the shot went off, I heard Sarah crying and sobbing, but no sign of Ryan. It was a chilling feeling to be there and hear it. I kept praying to hear shouting again, but it never happened. With each passing second, I feared more and more that Ryan was dead. A little later, I heard the police approaching the building. The sound grew louder until it stopped outside. I looked out the window and saw police cars and an ambulance parked outside. I stepped away from my door and heard the police knocking on the couple's apartment door. It sounded like 10 or 20 people were rushing to get into their place. Police officers, paramedics, and others. There were voices, but I wasn't paying much attention. Anyway, it was just the standard police procedure. Sarah was crying and not saying much that made sense. After a while, I heard Sarah being escorted out of the building, but I couldn't tell if she was being arrested. The tension in the air was palpable, and I found myself pacing back and forth in my apartment trying to calm down. The next day, I learned from another neighbor that the woman next door had been arrested for shooting Ryan. I was called as a witness because Sarah claimed the shot was in self-defense. I thought it didn't make sense because before the shot, it had basically been silent. If it had happened in the middle of a fight, then maybe self-defense would be plausible. I told the police what I heard and several other neighbors did the same. Ryan was in serious condition for several weeks, but eventually died from the injury. Based on my testimony, and that of several others, Sarah was charged with murdering her husband. The trial is scheduled for early next year, but I hope I don't have to testify.